When a child loses everything, sometimes hope comes from unexpected places. 9-year-old June thought her world ended when her great-aunt died, leaving her alone with a crumbling cabin in the Carolina woods and an old dog named Butter. Most people saw only tragedy, a little girl surviving on canned goods and kindness. But June's great-aunt had left something more valuable than anyone imagined. Deep beneath that weathered cabin lay a secret waiting generations to be found. When Butter started digging under the porch, he wasn't just being curious. He was uncovering nearly $3 million in war bonds, rare coins, and land deeds, a fortune belonging to June's freedman ancestor. But will one brave girl protect her inheritance when vultures start circling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. The social worker's car disappeared around the bend, leaving only dust and the sound of cicadas in the thick August air. June stood on the warped wooden steps of what was supposed to be her new home, clutching a garbage bag that held everything she owned in the world. At 9 years old, she had learned not to expect much from adults who promised things would get better, but even her low expectations hadn't prepared her for this. The cabin before her looked like something from a forgotten photograph. Weathered, grey boards curled away from the frame like peeling skin, and the tin roof bore patches of rust that spread like old bloodstains. A stone chimney leaned slightly to one side, as if it too was tired of holding things together. The front porch sagged under the weight of decades, its railing missing several spindles like gaps in an old man's smile. But it wasn't the cabin's appearance that struck June most. It was the profound quiet. After years of group homes filled with crying babies, slamming doors, and the constant noise of too many people in too little space, the silence felt almost sacred. Even the cicadas seemed to buzz more softly here, as if they understood this was a place where voices should be lowered out of respect. "Great-aunt Rosalie?" June called tentatively, her voice barely disturbing the stillness. No answer came from within the cabin, but something else responded, a low, gentle woof from somewhere around the side of the building. June set down her bag and followed the sound. There, in the shade of a massive oak tree, lay the largest dog she had ever seen. His coat was the color of churned butter, hence his name, she would later learn. Grey touched his muzzle and the tips of his ears, marking him as an elder among his kind. One brown eye and one blue eye regarded her with calm intelligence, and his tail gave a single dignified wag against the packed earth. "Hello there," June whispered, approaching slowly. She had learned to be cautious around animals, just as she had learned to be cautious around people. Too many foster homes had taught her that not every creature welcomed her presence, but Butter was different. As she drew near, he lifted his great head and sniffed the air around her, his expression thoughtful rather than wary. Then, with the deliberate movement of age and wisdom, he stood and walked to her side, pressing his warm flank against her legs in a gesture of immediate acceptance. June buried her face in his thick fur, breathing in the scent of sunshine and old wood, and something indefinably safe. For the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed completely. "June, child, is that you out there?" The voice came from inside the cabin, thin and wavering with age but warm with unmistakable affection. June straightened, Butter maintaining his protective position beside her. "Yes, ma'am, it's me." The screen door creaked open, and Great-aunt Rosalie emerged like a vision from another time. She was a small woman, probably in her 80s, with skin the color of polished mahogany and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her dress was simple but clean, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every step count. But it was her eyes that captured June's attention. They were the same warm brown as June's own, and they held a recognition that went deeper than mere family resemblance. When Rosalie looked at her, June felt truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. "My sweet child," Rosalie murmured, opening her arms. Come here to me." June hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the embrace. Rosalie's arms were thin but surprisingly strong, and she smelled of lavender soap and something else, something that reminded June of stories told by firelight and songs hummed while cooking. It was the scent of home, though June couldn't have named it then. "I'm so sorry about your mama," Rosalie whispered into June's hair. "She was my grandniece, you know. Your grandmother Lily was my sister's girl. I should have done more to stay in touch, should have known you needed family." June had only scattered memories of her mother, a woman who moved through life like a hummingbird, bright and beautiful, but never still long enough to build anything lasting. The cancer had taken her when June was 7, and since then she had been passed from one temporary situation to another, like a package no one quite knew how to deliver. "It's okay," June said, "because that's what adults always seem to want to hear." But Rosalie pulled back and studied her face with those knowing eyes. "No, child, it's not okay, and we don't have to pretend it is. Life hasn't been fair to you, and that's the truth of it. But you're here now, and you're family, and that means something." She led June inside the cabin, Butter following closely behind. The interior was dim and cool, a relief from the summer heat. The main room served as both living room and kitchen, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall and a simple wooden table marking the boundary between the two spaces. Everything was old, but meticulously clean, and sunlight filtering through gingham curtains cast a golden glow over surfaces polished smooth by decades of care. "I know it's not much," Rosalie said, watching June take in her surroundings, "but it's been in our family since right after the war, the first war, the big one. Your great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands when he came back from fighting for the Union, built it to last, and last it has." June nodded, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. The wood was dark with age and bore, the gentle indentations of countless meals, countless conversations, countless quiet moments of daily life. She could imagine generations of her family gathered around this same table, and the thought was both comforting and overwhelming. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the trees, Rosalie showed June to her room. It was small but cozy, with a single window that looked out over the garden and a narrow bed covered with the most beautiful quilt June had ever seen. The blanket was a masterpiece of careful stitching, with patches of fabric in every shade of blue and green arranged in a pattern that seemed to shimmer like water in the lamplight. "I made this for your grandmother when she was about your age," Rosalie said, smoothing the quilt with gentle hands, "but she never got to use it. Life took her away from here before she was grown, and by the time I finished it, she was already making her own way in the world. I've been saving it all these years, waiting for the right person to need it." June traced the intricate stitching with one finger, marveling at the thousands of tiny stitches that held the pieces together. Each patch seemed to tell a story. This one from a favorite dress, that one from a Sunday shirt, another from curtains that had brightened some long-ago window. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours now," Rosalie said firmly, "and this room is yours, and this home is yours for as long as you need it. I know the social worker said this was temporary, but I'm an old woman, June. I don't have much time left, and I don't have anyone else. If you'll have me, I'd like us to be family for real." That night, June lay under the quilt and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the deep woods, the soft hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures. In the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote singing to the moon. Butter had stationed himself on the floor beside her bed, his steady breathing a reassuring rhythm in the darkness. For the first time in 2 years, June fell asleep without fear. The next 3 days passed like a gentle dream. Rosalie taught her to tend the small garden behind the cabin, where tomatoes and beans and collard greens grew in neat rows. She showed her the root cellar, where preserves and canned goods were stored, cool and dark like a secret room beneath the earth. They picked blackberries together, their fingers staining purple as they filled an old mason jar with the sweet, tart fruit. Butter was never far from June's side during these explorations. He seemed to know the property better than anyone, leading her to the best berry patches and warning her away from the steep drop-off where the land fell away toward the creek. His protective instincts were subtle but constant, and June found herself trusting his judgment completely. Rosalie told stories as they worked, stories of their family, of the land, of the old days when the community was strong and everyone looked out for everyone else. She spoke of June's great-great-grandfather Ezekiel, who had fought at Gettysburg and came home to claim his piece of the American dream. She told of great-grandmother Sarah, who could grow anything in any soil and whose garden fed half the county during the hard times. But even as June began to feel the first stirrings of belonging, she noticed things about Rosalie that worried her. The old woman tired easily, often stopping to catch her breath after walking just a short distance. Sometimes she would start to say something and then trail off, her eyes distant and confused. And there were moments when she looked at June with an expression of profound sadness, as if she were memorizing her face. On the fourth morning, June woke to find Butter whimpering softly beside her bed. The morning light seemed different somehow, thinner and less warm than it had been the days before. She dressed quickly and went to check on Rosalie, Butter padding anxiously beside her. She found her great-aunt sitting in her favorite chair by the window, her hands folded peacefully in her lap and her eyes closed as if she were simply taking a brief rest. But June knew, even before she touched the cold hand, that Rosalie had slipped away during the night, as quietly and gently as she had lived. The funeral was small but dignified. Attended by a handful of neighbors, June had never met a few distant relatives who eyed the property with undisguised interest. The social worker came too, of course, with papers to sign and arrangements to make. June was to be placed in a new foster home within the week. The cabin would be sold to pay for Rosalie's final expenses, and Butter would be taken to the county shelter. But as the adults talked around her, making decisions about her life as if she weren't there, June made a decision of her own. That night, she packed her few belongings back into the garbage bag and made her way to the root cellar, Butter following faithfully behind. She had discovered during her explorations that the cellar had an old, forgotten entrance hidden beneath. A tangle of honeysuckle vines. It would be a place to hide until the social worker gave up looking for her. She had food, she had shelter, and she had Butter. Most importantly, she had the quilt that connected her to generations of strong women who had faced impossible odds and survived. Whatever happened next, she would face it as a freeman, on freeman land, surrounded by freeman love. 3 weeks had passed since June had disappeared into the woods, and the search parties had long since given up. The social worker had filed the appropriate reports, the distant relatives had stopped circling like vultures, and the cabin stood empty in the official records. But June was far from gone. She had settled into a routine that felt both precarious and surprisingly sustainable. Each morning, she would emerge from the root cellar where she slept and tend to the small garden that Rosalie had taught her to care for. The tomatoes were ripening now, heavy and red on their vines, and the late summer beans provided protein to supplement the canned goods from Rosalie's well-stocked pantry. Butter had adapted to their secret life with the wisdom of his years. During the day, when strangers might still occasionally drive up the long dirt road, he would disappear into the woods with June, teaching her the hidden paths and safe places that only he seemed to know. At night, he would curl up beside her in the cool darkness of the cellar, his steady breathing a comfort against the unfamiliar sounds of the deep forest. But lately, something had been different about Butter's behavior. It started small, a restlessness that seemed to have no cause, a tendency to pace the porch in the early morning hours when the mist still clung to the trees. He would stop suddenly during their walks, his head cocked as if listening to something June couldn't hear, his mismatched eyes fixed on some distant point that held no significance for her. It was while searching through Rosalie's kitchen drawers for a can opener that June made a discovery that would change everything. The drawer stuck, as old wooden drawers often do, and when she finally wrestled it open, the contents scattered across the worn linoleum floor. Along with the usual assortment of kitchen tools, something unexpected tumbled out. An old leather. A collar, cracked with age and worn smooth by years of faithful service. June picked it up with careful hands, turning it over to examine the tarnished brass nameplate that hung from the collar's ring. The metal was green with age, but she could still make out the words stamped into its surface. Ezekiel Freeman, 1865. Her breath caught in her throat. Ezekiel, the great-great-grandfather Rosalie had told her about, the Union soldier who had built this very cabin with his own hands. But if this was Ezekiel's collar, then Butter was— "How old are you, boy?" she whispered, holding out the collar for Butter to sniff. The moment the leather touched his nose, Butter's entire demeanor changed. His tail began to wag with an excitement June had never seen from him, and he pressed his great head against her hands with something approaching reverence. It was as if he recognized not just the scent, but the significance of what she held. June fastened the collar around Butter's thick neck, where it settled as if it had never been removed. The leather was supple, despite its age, shaped by years of wear to fit perfectly. And as soon as the buckle was secured, Butter's restless energy focused into something purposeful. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the front porch, his entire body tense with anticipation. Then he turned back to June and gave a short, commanding bark, the first sound she had ever heard him make. "What is it, boy? What do you want to show me?" Butter padded to the front door and waited, his eyes never leaving June's face. When she opened the door, he bounded out onto the porch with more energy than she thought his aged body possessed. But instead of heading into the yard or toward the woods as she expected, he went straight to the far corner of the porch and began sniffing along the foundation. June watched, puzzled, as Butter worked his way methodically along the base of the cabin, his nose pressed close to the weathered boards. His behavior was unlike anything she had seen from him, focused and determined, as if he were following a trail only he could detect. When he reached a spot near the center of the porch, Butter stopped. He looked back at June once, as if to make sure she was paying attention, then began to paw at the floorboards. The wood was old and warped, and under Butter's persistent scratching, June could see that one of the boards was looser than the others. "What's under there, Butter? What are you trying to find?" She knelt beside him and examined the loose board more closely. It was held in place by nails that had worked themselves partially free over the decades, and with a little pressure, she was able to lift it enough to peer into the dark space beneath. The gap revealed only shadows and the musty scent of old wood and earth. But Butter seemed convinced that something important lay hidden in that darkness. He whined softly and pawed at the opening, trying to make it larger. June spent the rest of that day thinking about what she had discovered. That evening, as she and Butter shared a simple meal of canned peaches and crackers, she studied the collar around his neck and tried to make sense of what it meant. "If you really are that old," she said to him, "then you've been guarding this place for a long, long time, haven't you? You knew Ezekiel and Sarah and all the others. You've been waiting for someone to come back." Butter's eyes met hers across the dim space of the root cellar, and in their depths she saw something that looked almost like recognition, not just of her presence, but of her purpose here, as if he had been waiting specifically for her. The next morning brought visitors. Miss Mary from down the road, accompanied by an elderly black man June had never seen before. They knocked on the cabin door and called her name, their voices kind but persistent. June crouched in the root cellar and held her breath, Butter silent and still beside her. "I know you're out there somewhere, child," Miss Mary called. "This is my friend Samuel Morris. He's a judge, retired now, but he knew your family way back. He's got some things to tell you about your people, about this land." June's heart hammered in her chest. A judge could mean trouble, official papers, court orders, a return to the foster system. but something in Miss Mary's tone suggested that Judge Morris wasn't here to take her away. "Your great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel," the man's voice carried. "Clearly through the morning air, he was a good man, child. Fought for his freedom and his family's future. Built this place to last, meant it to stay in freeman hands forever. There's things about this land, about your inheritance, that need to be set right." They waited for nearly an hour, calling periodically and leaving water and sandwiches on the porch steps. Finally, they drove away, but not before Judge Morris left a business card tucked under a stone near the front door. After they were gone, June emerged from hiding and examined the card. "Samuel Morris," it read. "Family law and civil rights." And below that, in handwritten script, "Your family's legacy matters. When you're ready to learn the truth, call me." That afternoon, June made a decision. She found a rusty shovel in Rosalie's garden shed and returned to the loose floorboard on the porch. Butter watched approvingly as she carefully pried up the board and several of its neighbors, revealing a dark space beneath the porch that smelled of decades and secrets. With Butter's encouragement, she began to dig. The earth was hard-packed and full of roots, but she worked steadily, following Butter's guidance as he sniffed and pawed at specific spots. Her hands blistered and her back ached, but something drove her forward, a sense that she was on the verge of uncovering something that had been waiting generations to be found. As the sun began to set and the shadows grew long, her shovel struck something that wasn't earth or root. Something hard and metallic that rang like a bell when steel met its surface. Butter's tail began to wag furiously as June cleared the dirt away from her discovery. Buried 3 feet beneath the porch of the cabin her ancestor had built was a metal box, roughly the size of a small suitcase and heavy enough that it took all her strength to pull it from the earth. The box was locked, its surface green with age and encrusted with dirt. But even in the fading light, June could see that it was made of quality metal, built to last and to protect whatever lay within. She looked at Butter, who sat watching her with an expression of profound satisfaction, as if a job that had taken him decades to complete was finally nearing its end. "This is what you've been guarding, isn't it, boy? This is what Ezekiel left for his family." Butter's answering bark echoed across the quiet forest, a sound of victory and vindication that seemed to wake the very trees from their evening slumber. June spent the entire night staring at the metal box, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion from digging. She had managed to haul it into the root cellar using a combination of determination and leverage from an old wooden plank, but now that she had it, she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. The box was unlike anything she had ever seen. Despite decades underground, its construction was remarkably solid. The metal was thick and heavy, designed by someone who understood that whatever went inside needed to survive not just time, but deliberate attempts to destroy it. The lock was equally formidable, an old-fashioned mechanism that had probably been sophisticated in its day and remained impenetrable now. Butter lay beside the box as if guarding it, his presence calm but alert. Every so often he would lift his greying muzzle and sniff at the metal, his tail giving a satisfied twitch as if confirming that yes, this was indeed what they had been searching for. When dawn finally crept through the hidden entrance to the cellar, June made her way up to the cabin to search for something that might help her open the box. Rosalie's tool collection was modest but well maintained. A hammer, a few screwdrivers, a small handsaw, and an assortment of other implements that spoke of a woman who preferred to fix things herself rather than depend on others. June tried the screwdrivers first, attempting to work them into the gap around the lock mechanism. The metal was stubborn, and she was afraid of damaging whatever might be inside, so she worked slowly and carefully. After an hour of patient effort, she felt something give. Not the lock itself, but the hasp that held it to the box. The metal was old enough that corrosion had weakened the screws holding the hasp in place. With careful application of leverage and time, June was able to work them loose one by one. When the last screw finally gave way, the hasp fell free with a metallic clank that seemed to echo through the quiet morning. Butter's ears perked up at the sound, and he rose to his feet with more energy than June had seen from him in days. His mismatched eyes fixed on the box, with an intensity that made her wonder exactly how long he had been waiting for this moment. June's hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. The hinges protested with a screech of metal on metal, but they held, and slowly the contents of the box were revealed. The first thing she saw was paper. Lots of it, yellowed with age and carefully wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. Beneath the papers, the box held other treasures, a leather pouch that clinked softly when she lifted it, revealing coins of various sizes and metals, some of which gleamed with the dull sheen of gold, even in the dim light filtering down from above. But it was the papers that drew her attention first. Someone had taken great care in preserving them, wrapping each document separately and arranging them in a specific order that suggested they told a story. Her family's story. The topmost document was written in faded brown ink on heavy paper. That felt substantial between her fingers. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the letters formed by someone who understood that words had weight and permanence. United States War Bonds, she read aloud, the words sounding strange in her young voice. Series E, issued 1942. The document was decorated with official seals and signatures, and there were more of them. Dozens of bonds, each representing money that someone in her family had saved for the future. Beneath the war bonds were older papers, their language more formal and archaic. Land grants and property deeds, some bearing the seal of the United States government and others from the state of North Carolina. June couldn't understand all the legal language, but she could make out names. Ezekiel Freeman appeared again and again, sometimes as grantor, sometimes as grantee, always in transactions involving substantial amounts of land. The coins told their own story. Some were ordinary pennies and nickels from decades past, but others were different, larger, heavier, made of metals that caught the light in ways that suggested value beyond their face amount. June had never seen coins like these except in pictures, but she knew enough to recognize that some of them were very old and potentially very valuable. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in its own piece of oiled cloth, was a leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside were still legible. Written in the same careful hand as the other documents, it appeared to be a record of financial transactions, property acquisitions, and family history spanning several decades. June opened the ledger carefully, afraid the old pages might crumble at her touch. But the leather binding had done its job well, and the paper remained supple enough to turn without tearing. The first entry was dated 1865, just after the war's end. Receive payment for service to Union Army, it read. Purchase land from Government Grant Program, 200 acres, good soil near water. Sarah says it will grow anything we plant. Sarah, her great-great-grandmother, the one Rosalie had told her about. The woman who could grow anything in any soil and whose garden had fed half the county during hard times. As June read through the ledger, a picture began to emerge of her ancestors' lives. Ezekiel had been more than just a former soldier. He had been a businessman, carefully investing his military earnings and government land grants into a substantial holdings. The entries documented purchases of additional property, investments in local businesses, and loans made to neighbors in need. But something had gone wrong. The entries stopped abruptly in 1870, 5 years after they began. The last notation was cryptic and troubling. Land taken by false papers. Judge says we have no recourse. Sarah says hide everything that matters. They can steal our land, but not our legacy. June felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the root cellar. Her family hadn't just lost their property through misfortune or financial hardship. It had been stolen. Someone had used fraudulent documents to take away everything. Ezekiel had worked for, everything he had fought for. She looked down at Butter, who had been watching her read with patient attention. "You knew, didn't you, boy? You've known all along what happened to our family." Butter's tail thumped against the earth floor of the cellar, and he moved closer to her side, pressing his warm bulk against her legs in a gesture of support and solidarity. June closed the ledger carefully and looked at the assembled treasures spread before her. War bonds worth thousands of dollars, coins that might be worth even more, and documents that told the story of a family's rise and fall. But more than that, she held proof that her people had been successful, had owned substantial property, had been respected members of their community before it was all taken away. The question now was what to do with that proof. She was 9 years old, living in hiding, with no legal guardian and no official existence. Who would believe her story? Who would care about the wrongs done to her family more than a century ago? But as she looked at Butter's steady, confident gaze, June felt something shifting inside her. She might be young, and she might be alone, but she wasn't powerless. She had the truth now, and the truth had its own kind of strength. The next morning brought a discovery that would prove to be the key to everything. As June carefully examined each document from the metal box, she found something that had been folded and placed beneath all the others. A set of official papers bearing the seal of the United States Army. The documents were in remarkably good condition, protected by an extra layer of oiled cloth that suggested someone had understood their particular importance. As June unfolded them with trembling fingers, she realized she was holding her great-great-grandfather's military discharge papers, complete with his service record and official commendations. "Private Ezekiel Freedman," she read aloud to Butter, who had positioned himself as her attentive audience for these morning reading sessions. 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Enlisted Boston, Massachusetts, February 1863. Discharged with honor, Reedville, Massachusetts, August 1865. The papers detailed Ezekiel's military service in careful official language. He had fought at Fort Wagner, at Olustee, and in the final campaigns that had brought the war to its end. Multiple commendations praised his courage under fire and his leadership of fellow soldiers, but it was the final document in the packet that made June's breath catch in her throat. "By order of the United States government," the official proclamation read, "and in recognition of faithful service to the Union cause, Private Ezekiel Freedman is hereby granted 200 acres of land in the state of North Carolina to be held in perpetuity by him and his heirs, according to the provisions of the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. 200 acres. June tried to imagine that much land. It was far more than just the small plot where the cabin sat. According to the detailed description in the grant, the original Freeman property had extended from the creek all the way to the main road, encompassing what was now several different farms, and even part of the small town that had grown up around the old crossroads. She spent the rest of that day exploring the papers more thoroughly, cross-referencing the land descriptions with what she could see from the cabin's windows and the hiking trails she and Butter had discovered. The original boundaries were marked by natural landmarks, a particular bend in the creek, a distinctive rock formation, an enormous oak tree that still stood near what was now the main road. Using one of Rosalie's old atlases, June was able to trace the approximate outline of the original grant. Her family hadn't just owned a homestead, they had owned a substantial portion of what was now some of the most valuable property in the county. As the implications began to sink in, June felt a mixture of excitement and anger that surprised her with its intensity. Her ancestors had been wealthy landowners, respected veterans, contributing members of their community. The poverty and displacement that had characterized her family's recent generations weren't the natural order of things. They were the result of a deliberate theft that had never been addressed or corrected. That afternoon, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would call Judge Morris, using Rosalie's old rotary phone, a relic that somehow still had a working connection. June dialed the number on the business card the judge had left. Her hands shook as she waited for someone to answer. And when a kind voice said, "Morris Residence," she almost hung up. "This is June Freeman," she managed to say. "You came to my cabin a few days ago. You said you knew my family." There was a pause, and then the voice warmed considerably. "June, child, thank goodness you're safe. We've been so worried about you. Where are you calling from?" "I'm still at the cabin. I've been hiding because I don't want to go back to foster care. But I found something, and I think you need to see it." "What did you find, sweetheart?" June looked down at the military papers spread across Rosalie's kitchen table. "My great-great-grandfather's discharge papers from the Union Army, and the land grant that gave him 200 acres, and papers showing how it was all stolen from my family." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that June wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Judge Morris spoke, and his voice carried a weight of emotion that she hadn't expected. "June, listen to me very carefully. What you've found could be extremely important, not just for you, but for a lot of families in similar situations. But you need to be very careful about who you tell and how you handle those documents. There are people who would prefer that this kind of evidence never see the light of day." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your family's story isn't unique. After the Civil War, the government granted land to thousands of freed slaves and Union veterans like your ancestor. Most of that land was later taken through legal fraud, forged documents, and corrupt court proceedings. The families who lost that land never got it back, and their descendants have lived in poverty ever since." June felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So even if I have the proof, it won't matter." "Oh, it matters," Judge Morris said firmly. "It matters more than you know. But fighting for justice isn't easy, especially when you're fighting powerful people who have profited from old injustices. You're going to need help, and you're going to need to be brave." That evening, June sat on the cabin's front porch, with Butter beside her, watching the sun set through the trees and thinking about what Judge Morris had told her. He was coming to see her tomorrow, bringing someone he called an expert in historical property rights, who could help evaluate the documents she had found. Part of her was excited about the possibility of reclaiming her family's legacy, but another part was afraid of what it would mean to challenge powerful interests, afraid of drawing attention to herself when she was still technically a missing person, afraid of hoping for something that might turn out to be impossible. Butter seemed to sense her internal struggle. He rose from his position beside her chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the property with the same alert attention he had shown when they were searching for the metal box. Then he turned back to her and gave a single, soft bark, not demanding or urgent, but somehow reassuring. June looked at the discharge papers she still held in her lap, at the official seals and formal language that proved her ancestors' worth and sacrifice. Ezekiel Freeman had fought for his freedom and his family's future. He had built this cabin with his own hands and filled that metal box with evidence of his success, knowing that someday his descendants would need proof of what they had lost. "You're right, boy," she said to Butter, who wagged his tail as if he understood every word. "We can't just hide down here forever. If Ezekiel was brave enough to fight in a war, I can be brave enough to fight for what he left us." The next morning would bring Judge Morris and his expert, and with them the first steps toward reclaiming a legacy that had been buried for far too long. June folded the discharge papers carefully and placed them back in their protective cloth, but she kept them close at hand. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Judge Morris arrived the next afternoon with a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Martinez, a historian who specialized in post-Civil War land grants and property rights. Dr. Martinez carried a weathered leather briefcase and had the kind of intense, focused energy that June associated with people who had dedicated their lives to uncovering buried truths. June met them on the front porch, Butter at her side as always. She had decided to trust Judge Morris, but caution had become second nature to her, and she wanted to get a sense of these people before showing them everything she had discovered. Dr. Martinez has been researching cases like yours for over 20 years, Judge Morris explained, as they settled into the old rocking chairs that Rosalie had kept on the porch. She's helped dozens of families trace their property rights and understand what happened to land that was taken from their ancestors. Dr. Martinez leaned forward with obvious interest. Judge Morris told me about your discovery, June. I have to say, finding original military discharge papers and land grants from the 1860s is extraordinarily rare. Most of these documents were deliberately destroyed or lost by the people who benefited from taking the land. June studied the historian's face, looking for any sign of the condescension or false sympathy she had learned to recognize in adults. But Dr. Martinez's expression held only genuine interest and respect, the look of someone who understood that June's story was part of a much larger pattern of injustice. I have more than just the discharge papers, June said finally. There's a deed, the original deed from 1865. Dr. Martinez's eyes widened. May I see it? June disappeared into the cabin and returned with the most significant document from the metal box, a large, official-looking paper that bore multiple seals and signatures. She had examined it carefully over the past few days, but there were still parts of the legal language that she didn't fully understand. Dr. Martinez handled the deed with the reverence of someone who understood its historical significance. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it and began to read the formal language that granted Ezekiel Freeman ownership of his land. "This is remarkable," she whispered. "It's in perfect condition, and it's completely legitimate. According to this document, your ancestor was granted 200 acres under the Southern Homestead Act with full mineral and water rights, to be held in perpetuity by the said Ezekiel Freeman and his heirs and assigns forever." "What does that mean exactly?" June asked. Judge Morris leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It means that the land was supposed to stay in your family permanently. No one had the legal right to take it away, and if they did, you and your descendants would have the right to get it back." Dr. Martinez was still studying the deed, comparing it with other documents she had pulled from her briefcase. "June, do you have any idea how much of this original land grant area is now developed? I've been driving through this region for years, and if I'm reading these boundary descriptions correctly, your family's original property includes part of what's now the town center, several residential developments, and at least 2 major commercial properties." June felt her stomach drop. She had suspected that the original land grant was valuable, but she hadn't fully grasped the scope of what her family had lost. How much would it be worth now? "Millions," Dr. Martinez said simply. "Probably tens of millions, depending on current market values and development potential." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the enormity of what they were discussing. June looked out over the small plot of land that surrounded the cabin, all that remained of what had once been a substantial estate, and tried to imagine what her life might have been like if her family had never lost their inheritance. "But how was it taken?" she asked. "The papers I found suggest it happened around 1870, but I don't understand how someone could just steal 200 acres of legally owned land." Dr. Martinez opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "That's where the real tragedy lies, June. What happened to your family wasn't unusual. It was part of a systematic effort to dispossess black landowners throughout the South during Reconstruction and beyond." She spread several historical documents across the small porch table, pointing to specific examples as she explained. There were dozens of methods used to separate black families from their land. Sometimes it was through discriminatory taxation. They would assess black-owned property at inflated values and then seize it for non-payment of taxes. Sometimes it was through legal fraud, forged documents, paid-off judges, fabricated debt claims. Judge Morris nodded grimly. In other cases, they would exploit the fact that many former slaves were illiterate and didn't understand complex legal procedures. A family might own land for years, only to discover that someone had filed papers claiming they never had legal title in the first place. Is that what happened to my family? Dr. Martinez pulled out another document, a photocopy of what appeared to be a court record from 1870. Based on my preliminary research, it looks like your ancestor was the victim of what we call title washing. Someone filed a claim saying that the original land grant had been issued in error, that Ezekiel Freeman wasn't entitled to the property under the homestead laws. June felt anger building in her chest, but he was a Union veteran. He earned that land. Absolutely he did, Dr. Martinez agreed. But by 1870, the political climate had changed. Federal protections for freed slaves were being rolled back, and local courts were often hostile to black property owners. The person who filed the false claim probably had connections to local judges and government officials. Judge Morris leaned forward. The good news, June, is that times have changed. Courts today are much more likely to recognize historical injustices and provide remedies for families who can prove their claims. The bad news is that fighting for your rights won't be easy. There are probably dozens of current property owners who would be affected if your family's original land rights were restored. June looked down at Butter, who had been listening to the conversation with his usual patient attention. Something about his steady presence gave her strength, reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone. She had ancestors who had fought for justice, and she had proof of what they had accomplished. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Dr. Martinez smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "First, we need to do a complete title search to document exactly how the land passed from your family to its current owners. Then we need to research the legal proceedings that resulted in your ancestor losing his property. If we can prove that those proceedings were fraudulent, and based on what I've seen so far, I think we can, then you would have grounds to file a lawsuit seeking restoration of your property rights. And in the meantime," Judge Morris's expression became serious. "In the meantime, you need to be very careful about who knows what you've found. There are people who have made a lot of money from land that rightfully belongs to your family. They're not going to be happy to learn that their ownership might be challenged." As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Martinez photographed all of June's documents and explained the legal process that lay ahead. Judge Morris promised to begin researching the current ownership of the original Freeman property and to identify potential allies in the legal community. When they finally left, June felt simultaneously hopeful and overwhelmed. She had proof of her family's rights, she had expert help, and she had a path forward. But she also understood that she was about to challenge people with far more power and resources than a 9-year-old girl living in hiding. That night, as she and Butter settled into their refuge in the root cellar, June carefully rewrapped the 1865 deed in its protective cloth. The paper felt heavier now that she understood its significance. Not just a historical curiosity, but a weapon in a fight for justice that had been waiting over 150 years to begin. 3 days after Judge Morris and Dr. Martinez's visit, June made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her great-aunt's death and her own presence at the cabin. She had been searching through Rosalie's bedroom for anything that might help her understand her family's history when she noticed something odd about the old family Bible that sat on the nightstand. The leather-bound book was thick and heavy, clearly old enough to have been passed down through generations. But when June picked it up, it felt heavier than it should have, and the pages didn't lie flat against each other the way they should in a book that was simply old. Something had been inserted between the pages. June opened the Bible carefully, mindful of its age, and found what she was looking for about halfway through the Old Testament. Tucked between the pages of Psalms was a thin, leather-bound journal that had been carefully cut to fit the exact dimensions of the Bible's pages. It was Rosalie's handwriting on the cover, though younger and more confident than the trembling script June remembered from her great-aunt's final days. The journal was filled with entries spanning several decades, written in the same careful hand, but with ink that varied from black to blue to brown, suggesting that Rosalie had been adding to it over many years. June settled into Rosalie's old rocking chair by the window and began to read. The first entry was dated 1962, when Rosalie would have been a young woman. Mama told me the story again today, it read, about our great-grandfather Ezekiel and what they took from our family. She made me promise to remember, to keep looking for proof, to never let the truth die out. She said someday someone would come back to claim what's ours, and I need to be ready to help them. June's heart began to race as she realized what she was reading. Rosalie had known about the family's lost inheritance all along. She had been actively searching for evidence, preparing for the day when someone would return to fight for what was rightfully theirs. The entries chronicled decades of research and frustration. Rosalie had spent years writing letters to government, offices, visiting courthouses, and tracking down elderly relatives who might remember details about the original property. She had documented every lead, every dead end, every small piece of evidence she managed to uncover. Found a lawyer today who says he might be able to help, read an entry from 1975. Samuel Morris, just graduated from law school and full of fire about civil rights. He says cases like ours are starting to be taken seriously by the courts. Asked him to keep our family name in mind if he ever comes across anything. June stopped reading and stared at the page. Judge Morris hadn't just happened to know about her family. Rosalie had been in contact with him for decades. They had been working together, preparing for this moment. She continued reading, her excitement growing with each entry. Rosalie had documented every aspect of the family's legal claim, had researched the current owners of the original Freeman property, and had even located other families in similar situations who might be willing to join forces in a legal challenge. But it was an entry from just 2 years ago that made June's breath catch in her throat. June called today, Rosalie had written. My grandniece, poor child. Her mama died and she's in the foster system. She doesn't know about our family's history, doesn't know what's waiting for her here. But I can hear it in her voice. She's got the Freeman spirit, the same strength that carried Ezekiel through the war and Sarah through the hard times that followed. I think she might be the one. The entries that followed documented Rosalie's careful planning to bring June to the cabin. She had contacted social services, had volunteered to take in her young relative, had prepared the house and arranged her affairs with the specific goal of passing the family legacy to June. I'm getting old, one of the final entries read. And Jake and my memory isn't what it was. But June is coming and everything is ready. The documents are safe where only family would think to look. Samuel knows to watch for her when I'm gone. Butter understands his job. He's been guarding this secret for so long, he won't let anything happen to her. June looked up from the journal to find Butter watching her from his position by the door. His mismatched eyes held that same look of patient intelligence she had noticed from the beginning, but now she understood what it meant. He wasn't just a dog who had happened to belong to her great-aunt. He was part of the plan, a deliberate guardian chosen to protect her and guide her to the truth. The final entries in the journal were practical instructions clearly meant for June. Rosalie had listed Judge Morris's contact information, had provided detailed descriptions of where the family documents were hidden, and had included warnings about family members who might try to claim the inheritance for themselves. There are cousins in Atlanta who heard rumors about family land, Rosalie had written. They don't know the details, but they've been asking questions. And there's a nephew in Charlotte who's gotten himself mixed up with some bad people. If word gets out about what June has found, they'll come looking for their share. She'll need to be careful who she trusts. But it was the very last entry that brought tears to June's eyes. It was dated just 1 week before Rosalie's death, written in the shaky handwriting that June remembered. I can feel my time ending, it read, but I'm not afraid, because June is here and she's everything I hoped she would be. Strong like Ezekiel, smart like Sarah, and brave enough to finish what our family started. I won't live to see justice done, but I know she will. The truth has been hidden long enough. It's time for the Freeman family to reclaim what was stolen from us. June closed the journal and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of generations of hope and planning that had led to this moment. Rosalie hadn't just taken her in out of kindness. She had been preparing for June's arrival her entire adult life. Every conversation they had shared, every story Rosalie had told about their family's history had been part of a careful education designed to prepare June for the battle ahead. She looked around the small bedroom that had been her sanctuary for the past month, seeing it now with new eyes. The carefully preserved furniture, the family photographs on the walls, the quilt that connected her to her grandmother. Everything had been maintained and protected as part of a larger plan to ensure that the family's legacy would survive. She knew, June whispered to Butter, who had moved to sit beside her chair. She knew everything that was going to happen. Butter's tail thumped against the wooden floor, and he pressed his great head against her leg in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. He had been part of this plan too, and now that June understood the full scope of what Rosalie had prepared for her, she felt both honored and terrified by the responsibility. Tomorrow, she would call Judge Morris and tell him about the journal. She would begin the process of claiming her inheritance and fighting for justice for her family. But tonight, she would honor Rosalie's memory by reading every word of the journal, absorbing every piece of advice and every warning, preparing herself to be worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. When Judge Morris arrived the following morning, he wasn't alone. 3 other people accompanied him, 2 elderly black women and a man who appeared to be in his 50s. They moved with the careful dignity of people who had lived through decades of disappointment but hadn't given up hope. June, Judge Morris said, as the group gathered on Rosalie's front porch, I'd like you to meet some people who have been waiting a very long time to hear your story. The judge carried a weathered leather briefcase that he set on the porch table with obvious reverence. These are the law books that have guided my career, he explained as he opened the case. Cases involving property rights, civil rights, and historical justice. Every precedent, every victory, every defeat in the long fight to restore stolen land to its rightful owners. June looked at the assembled group with growing curiosity. There was something in their expressions, a mixture of hope and skepticism that suggested they had been disappointed before. This is Mrs. Washington, Judge Morris continued, indicating the older of the 2 women. Her family lost 300 acres in Georgia in 1871. And this is Mrs. Thompson, whose grandfather's farm in South Carolina was taken through forged tax documents. And Mr. Davis here, his family owned a successful business district in Virginia that was seized during Jim Crow. June felt her understanding of the situation shifting dramatically. You mean this happened to other families too? Mrs. Washington leaned forward in her chair, her eyes intense. Child, what happened to your people happened to thousands of families all across the South. The difference is, most of us don't have the kind of documentation you found. Most of the evidence was destroyed or hidden away where we could never find it. Judge Morris opened one of his law books and showed June a page marked with numerous colored tabs. I've been documenting these cases for 40 years, he said. Family after family with stories just like yours. Union veterans and freed slaves who were granted land under Reconstruction laws, only to have it stolen through legal fraud and intimidation. Mr. Davis spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of decades of frustration. My great-grandfather owned 12 buildings in downtown Richmond, barbershops, restaurants, a hotel that catered to black travelers. All of it taken in 1889, when the city claimed he hadn't paid property taxes that he could prove he had paid. We've been fighting in court for 30 years with nothing to show for it. June looked down at Butter, who had positioned himself at her feet, as if sensing the importance of this conversation. But why are you telling me this? What does it have to do with my family's case? Judge Morris smiled, but it was a complicated expression that held both hope and determination. Because your case is different, June. The documentation you found is the kind of evidence that could change everything, not just for your family, but for all of these families and hundreds of others like them. He pulled out a thick, legal document and spread it across the table. This is a class action lawsuit that we've been preparing for years, a legal challenge that would force courts to examine the systematic theft of black-owned property throughout the post-Civil War period. But we've never had the kind of clear, undeniable evidence that would make such a case winnable. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward eagerly. Your great-great-grandfather's military records, the original land grant, the documentation of how the property was stolen, that's the kind of proof that could open the door for all of us. June felt the weight of expectations settling on her, shoulders like a heavy blanket. You want me to be part of a lawsuit? More than that, Judge Morris said gently. We want you to be the lead plaintiff. Your case would be the foundation that supports all the others. If we can prove that your family's land was stolen through legal fraud, it establishes the precedent we need to challenge similar thefts throughout the region. The enormity of what they were asking began to sink in. June looked around the circle of faces, seeing in each one the reflection of her own family's story. Generations of injustice, decades of struggle, a lifetime of waiting for someone to care enough to fight back. What would that mean exactly, she asked. Judge Morris opened another law book, this one filled with newspaper clippings and legal documents. It would mean that your case would attract national attention, media coverage, political pressure, and unfortunately, opposition from some very powerful people who have profited from land that was originally stolen from black families. Mrs. Washington nodded grimly. There are developers, politicians, and business owners who trace their wealth back to property that was taken from our ancestors. They won't give it up without a fight. But here's the thing, child, Mr. Davis added, his voice gaining strength. We've been fighting this battle for decades, and we've never had the weapons we needed to win. You've got those weapons now. The question is whether you're brave enough to use them. June stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the small plot of land that represented all that remained of her family's original holdings. Butter followed her, pressing against her legs in his usual gesture of support. She thought about Rosalie's journal, about decades of careful preparation and hope. She thought about Ezekiel Freeman, who had fought in a war for the right to own land and build a legacy for his descendants. She thought about all the families who had been cheated out of their birthright and were still waiting for justice. If I do this, she said finally, what happens to me? I'm still technically a missing person. Social services is still looking for me. Judge Morris's expression became serious. That's one of the complications we'll need to address. Fighting for your property rights will require you to come out of hiding, to become a public figure. There will be legal proceedings, media attention, and unfortunately, probably threats from people who want to see your case fail. But you won't be alone, Mrs. Thompson added quickly. There's a whole community of people who have been waiting for this opportunity. Lawyers, historians, civil rights organizations. They've all been preparing for a case like yours. June turned, back to face the group, her mind made up. What's the first step? Judge Morris smiled, and this time the expression was purely hopeful. The first step is to file a formal legal claim to your family's original property. We'll need to present all of your documentation to the court and formally challenge the current ownership of the land. He pulled out a map that showed the current development of the area that had once been the Freeman family farm. According to our research, your ancestors' original 200 acres now includes 3 residential subdivisions, a shopping center, part of the town's main commercial district, and 2 industrial properties. The current value of all that land is estimated at over $50 million. June felt her knees go weak. She had known that her family's lost property was valuable, but seeing it laid out like this, understanding the full scope of what had been stolen, made the injustice feel overwhelming. $50 million. she repeated quietly. It's not really about the money, Mrs. Washington said gently. It's about justice. It's about proving that our families mattered, that our ancestors were worthy of respect, that the crimes committed against them can't just be forgotten because enough time has passed. Judge Morris closed his law books and looked directly at June. I won't lie to you, child. This will be the fight of your life. There will be people who try to discredit you, who claim you're too young to understand what you're doing, who argue that historical injustices can't be corrected. But if you're willing to stand up and fight, you'll have an army of supporters behind you. June looked down at Butter, whose steady gaze seemed to hold all the wisdom and patience of his many years. She thought about Rosalie's careful planning, about the generations of her family who had waited for this moment, about the other families who were depending on her courage. When do we start? She asked. The transformation from scared, hidden child to determined advocate felt both sudden and natural. June Freeman was about to become the face of a movement for historical justice, and despite her youth, despite her fear, despite the enormous challenges that lay ahead, she was ready. Word of June's legal claims spread through the county faster than wildfire in dry timber. Within a week of filing the initial paperwork, strange cars began appearing on the dirt road that led to the cabin. Some drove slowly past, their occupants taking photographs of the property. Others parked nearby, their drivers making phone calls. While keeping the cabin under obvious surveillance, Judge Morris had warned June that this would happen, but experiencing it firsthand was more unsettling than she had imagined. Butter's protective instincts heightened dramatically during this period. He would position himself between June and any approaching strangers, his hackles raised and his usually gentle demeanor replaced by something altogether more formidable. It was during one of these surveillance periods that June made her most significant discovery yet. She had been searching through a box of old photographs that Dr. Martinez had requested, looking for any visual evidence of her family's life on the original property, when she found something that made her gasp aloud. Hidden between the pages of an old photo album was a large professional photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The image was sepia-toned and bore the photographer's stamp, J. Morrison Studios, Charlotte, NC, 1868. But it was the subject of the photograph that took June's breath away. The picture showed a black family standing in front of a substantial wooden house. Not the current cabin, but a larger, more elaborate structure that had clearly been built with pride and prosperity in mind. In the center of the group stood a tall, dignified man in a Union Army uniform, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman in a beautiful dress. Around them were arranged what appeared to be several children and elderly relatives, all dressed in their finest clothes for what was clearly a special occasion. But it was the background of the photograph that proved its significance. Behind the family, June could clearly see the distinctive rock formation that still marked the eastern boundary of the property, along with the massive oak tree that grew near what was now the main road. This was her family, her great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Freeman and his wife Sarah, standing on their own land in the years after the Civil War. The photograph was proof of everything she had been claiming. It was visual evidence that her ancestors had lived on the property as prosperous landowners, that they had built substantial improvements, that they had been respected members of the community with the resources to commission professional photography. Judge Morris was ecstatic when June showed him the photograph. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, handling the image with the same reverence he showed for his law books. A jury can argue about the interpretation of legal documents, but they can't argue with a photograph. This shows your family's legitimate claim to the property in a way that no amount of paperwork could. But the photograph's discovery seemed to intensify the opposition to June's case. The next morning, she woke to find the words "Go home" spray-painted across the side of the cabin in red letters that looked like blood in the early morning light. Miss Mary arrived shortly after June discovered the vandalism, bringing with her Two other neighbors June had never met, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, an elderly white couple who lived on what had once been the eastern edge of the Freeman property. "We heard about what happened," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking with indignation. "This is shameful behavior, and we want you to know that not everyone in this community supports it." Mr. Patterson nodded vigorously. "My grandfather told me stories about the Freeman family, said they were good people, helped their neighbors during hard times, always paid their debts. What happened to your folks was wrong, and it's past time somebody did something about it. Their support was encouraging. But Judge Morris warned June that for every neighbor who supported her case, there would be others who opposed it, either because they had been convinced that her claims were fraudulent, or because they had economic interests in maintaining the current property ownership. This division became apparent the following Sunday when June attended church for the first time. Since arriving at the cabin, Miss Mary had invited her, and June had decided that hiding was no longer an option if she was going to fight for her family's rights. The service itself was peaceful, with Pastor Williams delivering a sermon about justice and standing up for what was right. But during the social hour afterward, June overheard conversations that made it clear the community was deeply divided about her case. "That child's been filling her head with nonsense," one woman whispered to her companion. "My family's owned property in this area for generations, and there's never been any talk of it belonging to someone else." But another voice rose in June's defense. "Maybe that's because folks were afraid to talk about it," said Mrs. Johnson, the church organist. "My grandmother remembered the Freeman family, said they were cheated out of everything they had by people with more money and better lawyers." The tension in the room was palpable, and June found herself at the center of a conflict that had apparently been simmering beneath the surface of the community for generations. Some people approached her with encouragement and offers of support, while others looked at her with suspicion or outright hostility. It was Mr. Patterson who provided the most sobering information. "There's talk that some of the current property owners are hiring their own lawyers," he told Judge Morris quietly. "Big city firms with deep pockets and no scruples about fighting dirty." This news was confirmed the next week when June received her first official legal challenge. A law firm representing 3 of the current property owners filed a motion to have her case dismissed on the grounds that she was a minor without proper legal guardianship and therefore had no standing to file property claims. Judge Morris had anticipated this challenge and had been working on a solution. "We're going to request that the court appoint you a legal guardian specifically for the purpose of this case," he explained to June. "Someone who can represent your interests and ensure that your rights are protected throughout the legal process." "Who would that be?" "Me, if you're willing to trust me with that responsibility." June looked at the elderly judge, who had become her strongest advocate, thinking about Rosalie's journal and the decades of preparation that had led to this moment. "Rosalie trusted you," she said simply. "That's good enough for me." The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following month, but in the meantime, the pressure on June continued to intensify. She received phone calls at all hours, some offering to buy her property claims for substantial amounts of money, others making threats about what would happen if she didn't drop her lawsuit. Butter's protective presence became even more crucial. During this period, he seemed to sense danger before June was even aware of it, positioning himself between her and potential threats with an intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. When a car full of unfamiliar men drove slowly past the cabin one evening, Butter's low growling was enough to send them on their way without stopping. Dr. Martinez continued her research, uncovering more evidence of the systematic theft of black-owned property throughout the region. "Your case is just the tip of the iceberg," she told June during one of their regular meetings. "I found records of at least 20 other families in this county alone who lost substantial property through similar, fraudulent legal proceedings. But it was Judge Morris who provided the most startling revelation. During his research into the current ownership of the Freeman property, he had discovered that several of the key parcels were owned by a single holding company, a company that traced its ownership back to the very people who had orchestrated the original theft of Ezekiel Freeman's land. The same family that stole your ancestor's property has been profiting from it for over 150 years, he told June. They've built a business empire on land that rightfully belongs to your family, and they're not going to give it up without using every weapon at their disposal. This revelation transformed June's understanding of what she was fighting. This wasn't just about correcting a historical injustice. It was about challenging a system of wealth and power that had been built on stolen foundation. The people opposing her case weren't just protecting their current interests. They were protecting generations of profit from crime. As the court date approached, June found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The frightened, hiding child who had emerged from the root cellar was being replaced by someone stronger and more determined. She began speaking publicly about her case, giving interviews to reporters, and addressing community meetings with a confidence that surprised even her supporters. The transformation was internal as well as external. Looking at the 1868 photograph of her ancestor Ezekiel in his Union Army uniform, standing proudly on his own land with his family around him, June felt connected to a legacy of courage and determination that had been waiting generations to be reclaimed. He fought in a war for the right to own this land, she told a reporter from the Charlotte Observer. If he was brave enough to face Confederate soldiers, I can be brave enough to face their descendants in court. The night before the guardianship hearing, June sat on the cabin's front porch with Butter beside her, looking out over the property that had become the center of a legal and moral battle much larger than herself. Tomorrow would begin the formal, legal process that would determine not just her own future, but the future of dozens of other families seeking justice for historical wrongs. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The courthouse in Charlotte was not what June had expected. She had imagined something imposing and formal, like the courthouses she had seen in movies. Instead, the building was modern and businesslike, with fluorescent lighting and beige walls that made everything feel sterile and impersonal. Judge Morris had obtained special permission for Butter to accompany June into the courtroom, arguing that the dog served as both emotional support and a living connection to the historical evidence being presented. Butter lay quietly beside June's chair at the plaintiff's table, his presence a steady comfort in the intimidating environment. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators, reporters, and representatives from various civil rights organizations who had come to observe what many were calling a landmark case. Mrs. Washington, Mrs. Thompson, and Mr. Davis sat in the front row behind June, their faces reflecting the hope and anxiety of people who had waited decades for this moment. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a distinguished African-American woman in her 60s, called the court to order with a gravity that suggested she understood the historical significance of the proceedings. "We are here today," she announced, "to consider the property claim of June Freeman versus multiple defendants regarding land originally granted to her ancestor Ezekiel Freeman under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. The defendant's attorney, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit, stood to present his opening statement. "Your Honor," he began, "this case represents an attempt to overturn more than 150 years of settled property law based on the confused claims of a 9-year-old child who has been manipulated by activists seeking to profit from manufactured historical grievances." June felt her cheeks burn with anger, but Judge Morris placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. They had prepared for this kind of attack, and they were ready to respond. When it was Judge Morris's turn to speak, he stood with the dignity of someone who had spent his entire career fighting for justice. "Your Honor, we are not here to overturn settled law, but to expose and correct a historical fraud. The evidence we will present today proves that Ezekiel Freeman's property was stolen through forged documents and corrupt legal proceedings, and that his descendant, June Freeman, is the rightful owner of the land in question. The first part of the hearing focused on establishing June's legal standing to bring the case. Judge Morris presented documentation proving her lineage back to Ezekiel Freeman, along with the court's appointment of him as her legal guardian for the purposes of the proceedings. Then came the moment June had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, her opportunity to present the evidence she had discovered. With trembling hands, she stood and approached the witness stand, Butter following closely behind to lie at her feet. "June," Judge Morris said gently, "please tell the court how you came to discover the documents that form the basis of this case." June took a deep breath and began to tell her story. Her arrival at Great-Aunt Rosalie's cabin, Butter's strange behavior, the discovery of the metal box buried beneath the porch. As she spoke, Judge Morris presented each piece of evidence: Ezekiel's military discharge papers, the original 1865 land grant, the family photographs showing the Freeman family on their property. But it was when Dr. Martinez took the stand that the real bombshell was revealed. She presented the results of her research into the historical records, including documents that June had never seen before. "During my investigation," Dr. Martinez testified, "I discovered court records from 1870 that shed new light on how the Freeman property was taken. These documents, which were filed away and apparently forgotten for 150 years, show clear evidence of fraud." She held up a thick folder containing photocopies of original court documents. "These papers show that the legal proceeding that resulted in Ezekiel Freeman losing his property was based on a forged deed claiming that someone else had prior ownership of the land. The signature on this deed has been analyzed by handwriting experts and found to be fraudulent." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of surprise and outrage. June watched as the defendant's attorneys huddled together, clearly caught off guard by evidence they had not expected. But the defendants fought back aggressively during cross-examination. The sharp-faced attorney subjected June to nearly an hour of hostile questioning, challenging her understanding of the documents, questioning her motives, and suggesting that she was being used by adults with their own agenda. "Miss Freeman," he said with condescending patience, "do you really expect this court to believe that a 9-year-old child is capable of understanding complex legal documents from the 1860s? June felt herself beginning to waver under the aggressive questioning. The attorney was skilled at making her feel small and confused, and she began to doubt whether she really understood what she was fighting for. I know what the papers say," she stammered. "They show that my family owned the land. But you can't really read these documents yourself, can you? You're just repeating what adults have told you they mean." It was then that Butter did something unexpected. The old dog rose from his position at June's feet and walked slowly to where the 1868 family photograph was displayed on an easel. He sat down directly in front of the image and looked back at June with an expression that seemed to say, "Remember who you are." The simple gesture gave June the strength she needed to find her voice again. June looked at Butter sitting before the family photograph, and suddenly everything became clear. She straightened in the witness chair and looked directly at the attorney who had been trying to intimidate her. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am 9 years old and I can't understand all the legal language in these old papers, but I can understand right from wrong. I can understand that my great-great-grandfather fought in a war to earn the right to own land, and that someone stole it from him through lies and fake papers." She gestured toward the photograph where Butter still sat guard. "That picture shows my family standing on their own property, dressed in their best clothes, proud of what they had built. They weren't poor or ignorant or undeserving. They were successful people who had their success stolen from them. And you're asking me to just forget about that, to pretend it doesn't matter because it happened a long time ago. The courtroom was completely silent as June continued. "But it does matter. It matters because every day since then, my family has been poor when we should have been prosperous. It matters because other families like mine have been told their ancestors didn't count, that their losses don't matter. It matters because justice doesn't have an expiration date." Judge Morris smiled with obvious pride as June returned to her seat. The defendant's attorney had no more questions. The final arguments lasted another hour, but June could sense that something had shifted in the courtroom during her testimony. Judge Hendricks listened intently to both sides, occasionally asking pointed questions about specific pieces of evidence. When the arguments concluded, Judge Hendricks announced that she would recess for 1 hour to review the evidence before rendering her decision. June spent that hour in a small conference room with Judge Morris, Dr. Martinez, and the other families who had been following the case. No one said much. They all understood that the next hour would determine not just June's future, but the future of dozens of similar cases across the South. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks's expression was grave but determined. She began by acknowledging the historical significance of the case. "This court recognizes," she said, "that we are dealing with injustices that occurred during one of the most troubled periods in American history. The systematic theft of property from newly freed slaves and black Union veterans represents one of the greatest crimes ever perpetrated against American citizens. For too long, these crimes have gone unaddressed because the victims lacked the resources and documentation necessary to seek justice." June held her breath as the judge continued. "However, in this case, the plaintiff has presented evidence that is both compelling and conclusive. The military service records, the original land grant, the photographic evidence, and most importantly, the court documents from 1870 that prove fraudulent proceedings were used to steal the Freeman family property. All of this creates a clear picture of deliberate criminal activity." Judge Hendricks looked directly at June. "Miss Freeman, based on the evidence presented to this court, I find that your family's original claim to the property in question is valid, and that the subsequent transfer of that property was accomplished through fraudulent means." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. June felt tears streaming down her face as the full meaning of the judge's words sank in. "Therefore," Judge Hendricks continued, raising her voice above the celebration, "I hereby order that the original 200-acre land grant to Ezekiel Freeman be restored to his legal heir, June Freeman. The current property owners will be compensated at fair market value through a fund established by the state, but the land itself belongs to the Freeman family." Judge Morris embraced June as photographers captured the historic moment. Mrs. Washington, Mrs. Thompson, and Mr. Davis were crying openly, understanding that June's victory opened the door for their own cases to move forward. But the judge wasn't finished. She called for order and made one final statement that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. "This case establishes an important precedent," she announced. "This court will be prepared to consider similar cases where families can provide evidence of fraudulent property theft during the post-Civil War period. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and it is never too late to correct historical wrongs." The celebration continued outside the courthouse, where a crowd of supporters had gathered. Television cameras captured June as she stood on the courthouse steps, holding the official court order that restored her family's property rights. The document, printed on heavy legal paper and bearing Judge Hendricks's official seal, was more than just a piece of paper. It was vindication for generations of her family who had been told their claims didn't matter. "How does it feel to win?" a reporter asked. June looked down at Butter, who had remained by her side throughout the entire ordeal, then back at the crowd of supporters who had made this victory possible. "It feels like coming home," she said simply. Judge Morris approached with another document, a new property deed that officially transferred ownership of the Freeman land back to June. As she held the deed, Feeling the weight of history and justice in her hands, June understood that she had become something she never expected to be, a symbol of hope for families who had been waiting generations for someone to care about their losses. That evening, as news of the ruling spread across the country, June received calls from families as far away as Texas and Florida, all of them with stories similar to hers. All of them suddenly believing that justice might be possible after all. The frightened child who had hidden in a root cellar was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who understood that sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference. 6 months after the court ruling, the cabin in the Carolina woods bore little resemblance to the weathered structure June had first encountered as a frightened 9-year-old. The roof had been repaired with new tin that gleamed silver in the morning sun. The foundation had been reinforced, and the sagging porch now stood straight and proud. But the most significant changes weren't visible from the outside. They lived in the confidence of the young girl who called the place home. June stood in what had once been Rosalie's garden, now expanded into a thriving patch that would have made her great-aunt proud. The late autumn harvest lay spread across the porch in baskets, sweet potatoes, collard greens, and the last of the tomatoes that had somehow survived the first frost. Butter lounged in his favorite spot beneath the oak tree, wearing a new collar that had become something of a local legend. The collar was made of the finest leather, with a brass nameplate that read, "Butter Freeman, Guardian of Legacy," in elegant script. Judge Morris had commissioned it as a gift, understanding that Butter's role in uncovering the family treasure deserved recognition. The old dog wore it with the dignity of someone who had finally completed a job that had taken him decades to finish. The settlement from the court case had provided June with more money than she had ever imagined possible. The State Compensation Fund had purchased the developed portions of the original Freeman property at current market value, leaving June with enough resources to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But more importantly, she retained ownership of the original 200 acres, including mineral and development rights that would ensure future generations of Freemans would never face poverty again. Judge Morris had become her official guardian, a role that suited them both perfectly. He had moved into a small cottage on the property, close enough to provide guidance and protection, but far enough away to allow June the independence she had earned through her courage. Their evening conversations on the porch had become a cherished tradition, with the old judge sharing stories of his legal career while June told him about her plans for the future. "The foundation paperwork came through today," Judge Morris announced as he joined June for their evening ritual. "The Freeman Family Justice Foundation is officially established." June smiled as she settled into her rocking chair, the same one where Rosalie had spent her final days. The foundation had been her idea, a way to use her settlement money to help other families research and pursue their own claims to stolen property. Dr. Martinez had agreed to serve as the foundation's chief researcher, and they had already identified more than 50 families with potentially valid claims. "Mrs. Washington called this afternoon," June said. "The judge approved her case for trial next month. She said to thank you for the legal advice." "Mrs. Washington has been fighting for her family's land for 40 years, Judge Morris replied. "She deserves to see justice as much as anyone." The success of June's case had indeed opened floodgates throughout the South. Courts that had previously dismissed such claims as too old or too complex were now taking them seriously, understanding that the precedent set in Freeman v. multiple defendants created new legal obligations to address historical wrongs. June's transformation over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The frightened child, who had once hidden in a root cellar, was now a confident young woman who spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and corresponded with families from across the country who were seeking her advice and support. She had been featured on the cover of Time magazine as the young face of historical justice and had received honorary degrees from 3 universities. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from her own community. The people who had once viewed her with suspicion now treated her with respect and admiration. Miss Mary had become like a grandmother to her, stopping by regularly. With casseroles and gossip from town, the Pattersons had deeded a small portion of their property back to the Freeman estate, acknowledging that it had originally belonged to June's family. Even some of the people who had initially opposed her case had come around, understanding that justice for one family didn't diminish the rights of others. Pastor Williams had asked June to speak at the church's annual homecoming service, where she had addressed a congregation that included descendants of both slaves and slaveholders, Union veterans and Confederate sympathizers. Her message had been simple but powerful. The past couldn't be changed, but its injustices could still be corrected. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, she had told the packed church. It means choosing to build something better on the foundation of truth. As autumn deepened into winter, June had begun making plans for the next phase of her life. She would attend the local public school, something that had seemed impossible when she was a fugitive from the foster care system. Judge Morris had arranged for tutoring to help her catch up academically, but June's real education had come from the legal battle that had thrust her into the national spotlight. The restored cabin would remain her home, but she was also designing a research center that would be built on the property to house the foundation's work. The center would include a museum dedicated to the history of land theft from black families, along with offices for the lawyers and historians who were now working full-time to pursue similar cases. But tonight, as she and Judge Morris sat in comfortable silence listening to the sounds of the forest, June's thoughts turned to simpler things. Tomorrow, she would start her new school, where she would be just another student, rather than a symbol or a celebrity. She was looking forward to the normalcy of homework and teenage friends and all the ordinary experiences that had been denied to her during her extraordinary year. Butter's soft snoring from beneath the oak tree provided a gentle accompaniment to the evening's peace. The old dog had earned his rest, having finally delivered on a promise that had taken him generations to fulfill. His new collar caught the last rays of sunlight, the brass nameplate gleaming like a badge of honor. June pulled Rosalie's quilt more tightly around her shoulders and smiled at the continuity of it all. The quilt that had once represented her only connection to family history now covered a young woman who had become the keeper of that history for future generations. The cabin that had once been a refuge for a frightened child was now the headquarters of a movement for justice. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, June could almost hear the whispered approval of ancestors who had waited 150 years for someone to remember their names and fight for their legacy. The Freeman family was home to stay.